Listo. Buenos días a todos, a todas, los presentes aquí, los que nos acompañan a través de nuestras redes sociales. Una disculpa por empezar un poquito tarde, pero vamos a dar inicio a estas dos pláticas que cierran nuestro pequeño coloquio sobre... Perdón, estoy aquí balanceando. Nuestro pequeño coloquio sobre ciencias del comportamiento y su intersección con inteligencia artificial. Y el día de hoy tenemos la fortuna de contar con la presencia de dos investigadores que nos visitan del MIT, de la Escuela de Administración de Empresas Sloan. Y agradezco a Antonio Alonso Arechar haber hecho este contacto y a través de él hacer efectiva la presencia tanto de Michael Nicholas Stagnaros, quien va a iniciar esta sesión de dos pláticas, y a Joshua White, que nos va a dar el cierre. Y no me dilato más, simplemente presentando a Nicholas, que es, como ya lo dije, investigador en la Escuela de Administración y Dirección de Empresas Sloan del MIT, becario de investigación en el Centro PAX, que es el Centro de Filantropía y Sociedad Civil de la Universidad de Stanford. Él obtuvo su doctorado en psicología en la Universidad de Yale y la licenciatura, su BA también en psicología en la Universidad de San Francisco, con una especialización secundaria en religión comparada, lo cual es llamativo. Su trabajo se centra en varios temas, principalmente la comprensión de cómo se forman y cambian las creencias firmemente arraigadas, que es la cognición subyacente de las ideologías y grupos, y también está interesado en temas más generales sobre metodología experimental y la mejora general de la investigación en ciencias sociales. Sin más, le doy la palabra y la bienvenida a Nicholas Stagnaros, quien nos va a hablar sobre el malentendiendo el razonamiento motivado, información sobre identidad como el principal motor de riesgo de sesgos políticos. Misunderstanding, Motivated Reasoning, Information over Identity as the Main Driver of Political Bias. Y démosle un fuerte aplauso a Nick Stagnaros, por favor.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate it. Oh, sorry. I think this is supposed to be in presenter mode. It is not, but that is okay. It's also advanced forward. So let me just do one thing extremely quickly. All right, we'll see how this goes. It's going to be in presenter mode, but I'm just going to try to see what I can do from memory. So thank you so much for having us come and give a talk. This is a great experience. I would say that everything I'm going to present today is stuff that's not published. It's ongoing work, and so any feedback people have is like super useful. It's quite helpful to hear people's thoughts and ideas about kind of what we're going to be talking about, because that'll definitely go into like future papers as they're being developed. So it's just great to get feedback. I personally actually really appreciate critical feedback. So things you don't like, things you find not very convincing, things you just generally find wrong is like actually stuff I would love to hear. I also have not given this talk before in its current structure. I've kind of talked about each one of these separate things, but we had a little bit of time today, so I had to kind of combine them all together and share them as a kind of more like central theme. So without the presenter mode, we'll see how well I can do from memory, but it's going to be an interesting dynamic. Also, I talk very fast normally, and I'm going to normally try very hard to like slow things down when I talk. I'm not very good at it. You guys have been very generous and not asked me to give this talk in Spanish, which would be a much worse talk. So I'm going to just try very hard to kind of go smoothly. I'm definitely going to end up speaking a bit faster, and I apologize. If there's anything you want me to repeat, if you want me to slow down, you can just go like this, or you could just like ask me to repeat it or go through it. I'm very happy to do any of that. So I'll do my best, but you know, c'est la vie. Great. Okay. So there you go. So the talk that I kind of want to get into today is basically getting at this idea that there's a lot of people in the world, I think a lot of us have experienced this, who hold beliefs that are really kind of passionate. They're about usually like ideological or political content. And these beliefs sometimes are sort of completely unrelated or unbound by factual information, and sometimes they're actually in direct conflict with the best available information for people. And despite the fact that actually small amount of work can sometimes correct some of these beliefs or help kind of nuance them, is a way of thinking about that, people still hold these very, very strong, kind of almost like dogged beliefs, and they'll pay really high costs for them. And so we're kind of curious why. The general kind of motivation for a lot of the work that I'm interested in is, what is sort of driving people into this space, even though they could potentially make better decisions or hold more accurate representations. One particular explanation for this that a lot of people go into in the context of psychology and political science and whatnot is this idea of motivated reasoning. And so this is just a process by which motivations influence reasoning through reliance on biased cognitive processes. And oftentimes what this is looking like is people who are motivated by their self-concept, the beliefs of people in their community, and the beliefs of, say, like high elites that are very kind of close to them. And so I'm sure a lot of people in here are already kind of familiar with this idea, but just as like a toy concept, as we walk through the talk, I'll basically start with this. You're a randomly assigned person, a randomly selected person, and this person is trying to decide whether or not they think gun control is something that is of value or if they think guns are fine and safe. And so from the motivated reasoning perspective, this individual is going to kind of oftentimes reference their own self-concept, their identity. They're going to be thinking about their political and religious groups, kind of like high-status elites within their groups, and use that as a reference point to how to think about what they should be thinking about with regard to guns. On the motivated reasoning count, critically, new information, new sort of data that comes in front of them is going to do very little to kind of affect that belief. They're going to be kind of like anchored very much so onto a place of where they think they should be in their community is going to be. And so that's sort of like one framework to how to think about how people come to these sort of beliefs and these decisions. Another one is just taking this idea of kind of Bayesian cognition, which is a shorthand I'll use throughout the talk. But basically this idea of a lower level cognitive processing, oftentimes described as being rational, although it's subject to cognitive constraints, like the information environment a person is in, and oftentimes focuses just on how prior beliefs are sort of scaffolded into a current belief. It's a general idea. So on this account, people definitely take data and information into how they think about a new context or a new concept. Along with that, they'll also, opposed to taking just like straight data, they also might think of like information that they're getting from close relationships or trusted news sources. It's not just these people are scientists. People are often operating in the world, just sort of like sampling what other people know as they're trying to scaffold their own understanding. And critically, what's happening here is this isn't necessarily something that's yoked to their identity. And a key idea of this is that if new information comes in that's totally independent of identity, people can still incorporate that into that belief. That's still sort of something that can like function and actually permeate how people are thinking about a given context. So we have these sort of two models of human cognition, and what we're interested in is getting an idea of like how well do both of these describe the type of behavior that we see in the world, and particularly the type of evidence that we have seen within the literature up to date. So this idea is not particularly novel. This idea that like there's a tension between like how people use evidence and sort of like rational thinking and how that kind of like fits into a space where people are also have identities and are motivated by their community. There's quite a lot of research that's been looking at this, and so because I'm going to use a lot of these paradigms in several of the studies I'm going to present to you, I'm going to walk through them really quickly. I'm guessing a lot of people in here are already kind of familiar with at least a subset of them, but to get us all on the same page, I'm going to kind of run through it. So the first paradigm, and sort of like the best controlled, the sort of like tightest experimental paradigm, comes from Dan Kahan, sometimes referred to as the 2x2 contingency table. The general shtick, you guys are probably already reading this a little bit when I was sitting on the screen like a few minutes ago, is that there's the researchers present participants with some theoretical study, a hypothetical study, that talks about some contentious issues. So it's like a study that was done to look at the effect of gun control in cities. As an example, there's many different versions of this. Participants aren't told what the study finds. They're just said, okay, well, the study was run, here's the data that was acquired from this hypothetical study, and the data is presented on the rows as being sort of like the cities that did or did not do a thing, or the manipulation that took place. So in this case, cities that did or did not enact like a ban on concealed carry. And then on the columns, you have whether or not crime increased or decreased as from the counts. And then you have this table, and the idea is that people can like interpret that table and try to make a sense of what happened. The manipulation is really subtle. They just flip the columns experimentally to basically show that outcome that people say most desire, or sort of most in line with their identity, whether or not that sort of large number in the top left-hand corner is like affirming that or not. And the general takeaway is, then what happens is people then are just asked, okay, what does the data show? So they're basically just asked, what do you think this data is presenting you? And the general result from much of this work and number of replications, people are just better at like correctly interpreting the data when the data supports their pre-existing belief. That's a general takeaway of how you should think about that. Another paradigm made famous by Lord, Ross, and Leopard basically is a little similar. You present people with another hypothetical study. The study manipulates. They sort of describe, again, the same kind of setup, but then they just tell you exactly what the study did. So the study basically shows that like gun control lowers crime or increases crime. And then the outcome is basically whether or not how people want to rate the experimental methodology of the study. So the idea being, if the study kind of aligns with your beliefs, do you think that that study was executed well versus when the study does not align with your beliefs? And the general takeaway is that people show, research has shown that people are more likely to rate the exact same style of methods as being better when those methods produce a study that affirms their belief. So the third thing, I promise it's not going to take forever to walk through all this past research, but it's helpful to get us on the same page. The third experimental paradigm is kind of interesting. It uses this idea of belief bias. It's a little bit more technical. But the way this experiment works is you present people with these, it's called logical syllogisms. And the idea is you have given a piece of information. So in this context, strengthening the local economy increases the diversity of the local workforce. People are then given another piece of information, increasing immigration increases the diversity of the local workforce. And then they're given a conclusion from those two pieces of information. So therefore, increasing immigration strengthens the local economy. And the conclusion either is like valid or invalid based off of the information that you see ahead of time. So it's just purely logic. It's not about previous content in the world. And what people are asked to do then is say, okay, just rate whether or not the conclusion is sort of a valid conclusion from those two pieces of evidence that we presented to you. And what you end up finding is that belief bias, which is this idea that people are sort of more inclined to sort of like interpret things as correct or accurate when it sort of kind of conforms what they think is true about the world. In line with that, people are more likely to interpret these syllogisms as correct incorrectly, or another way of saying is that they're more likely to kind of correctly interpret them when they are set up to like affirm the type of thing they already think to be true. And the very last one, I promise, is this paradigm it's really been popular. It's much more like ecologically valid. It's all about just rating arguments. It's also a lot less carefully controlled. The sort of more famous version was put together by Tabor and Lodge. The general idea is that you give people arguments. These arguments are for and against a particular a topic, or so you think about like immigration is good for the economy. It's an argument for and against that. And then sometimes they'll manipulate the quality of the arguments. So sometimes they'll give, a version that is mismatched on the argument strength using sort of like reasoning errors or something of this nature, or independently rated as strong or weak. And then the idea here, the general takeaway, they get people at every argument to kind of rate it on a couple of different dimensions. The general takeaway is that people rate arguments of equivalent sort of quality or strength. The argument that is sort of arguing for the position they already believe, they rate that as being a stronger argument relative to one that they disagree with. And you can even see that in the context where it's a weaker argument that actually agrees with them, and they'll rate that one as being stronger than the stronger argument that's against them. It's a popular paradigm. It's really, really hard to tightly control that because there's just so much that goes into developing an argument that is above and beyond just strength. But I'll kind of get into it a little later. Because again, it's definitely been quite well used, and so we include it in the setup. So these are four, what I would argue is popular and relatively strong experimental paradigms that basically have been used in a lot of the literature to show that like, motivated reasoning just is a thing, right? That people have kind of used these things, they've kind of deployed these studies as I've described them, and as I've walked through all of them, they clearly provide evidence that can be interpreted as being like, yeah, people engage in biased reasoning in the direction of their identity and what they sort of prefer to be true about the world. But over a period of time, people started like wondering, okay, well, it's pretty hard to like separate out the way people's identities are associated with how they're answering this and just what they think is true about the world from like this more like prior beliefs Bayesian framework, right? People sort of know something about the world, and so is it the case that it's about their identity that's driving how they're answering, or is it because they are sort of trying to like reason somewhat rationally through it? And so a great example of this is I can give you a study, and one study basically says, oh, it turns out just like all immigration is just horrible and it causes crimes. And I can give you the exact same study design and say immigration's on net like pretty good, like increase the economy. Like it is reasonable if you think that immigration doesn't produce like widespread like disease and famine to think there's probably just something weird about that first study. I understand that it has the same methodology. These are oftentimes also done between subjects, but you're going to just draw some inference from the conclusion about the study was run. A more extreme version of like the study that shows the Earth is flat. You just be like, maybe not a good study. I don't know everything about what was done, but I think it's not great. And so after a period of time, there was a lot of this pushback that like, okay, this sort of like understanding is probably not producing what we think it is. And so there's kind of a lot of papers that got published after this that basically argued for the position that people's prior belief really just confounds their identity in a lot of these cases. And you can't really separate these things. If I indicate myself as being like a kind of a progressive liberal, and I think immigration is good, it's going to be just very hard to like sort of experimentally tease those apart, as has been described. And so what ended up happening is this thing is called negative evidence against motivated reasoning. Some people have kind of used the way of describing this, which is sort of like, you can't really know. It's just kind of confounded. I personally find that to be like a less than satisfactory answer. It's not particularly motivating. And so in this talk, I'm going to try to convince you, maybe or maybe not successfully, we'll see how this goes, that you can separate these things apart, and you can actually produce not just like negative evidence, but we actually could we can run tests that actually produce positive evidence that that actually appropriately addresses this question of like, what is priors doing, what is identity doing? So the first thing we're going to hit is we're going to do basically removing identity, but leaving priors beliefs. It's a little bit like awkward, but I'll walk through what I'm doing here. So the general idea here is we're going to take those paradigms and we're going to try to strip identity out of them and then just see, okay, you just leave prior beliefs. Like, what does that look like in the context of these paradigms? So I'm going to gloss over a lot of stuff across this talk because I've decided to include way too many things in this talk, so that was interesting. And so bear with me that if you want to ask questions or push back about any detail of any study or any sub-part of the study, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A or just after, however. But for the sake of the talk, I'm just going to gloss over a lot of stuff and walk through it, but it might seem a little bit overly simplistic. So for this study, we collect 6,500 individuals. These individuals are then randomized to, we first filter them on attention, get their demographics, and then critically, we get their prior beliefs on a given topic, on all of the topics that are presented. They're then randomized to either have, in the context of the experiment, a topic that is political in the way we're thinking about this as something that's involving their identity. So think about this as they're going to engage in a topic on gun control, immigration, healthcare, so on and so forth. Or they're going to be randomized to get a topic that has nothing to do with their identity. So things like daily vitamin use, sunscreen's effect on skin health, renting versus owning a home, things like that. Then they're going to go walk forward and they're going to engage in one of these experimental paradigms. So the 2x2 table I walk through, study evaluation, we're just going to break out for the sake of the talk. We'll show the quantities for both the sample size critique and also causal inference, how well the study was able to kind of produce a good causal inference for the results. The syllogism paradigm I discussed, and then also argument evaluation. So that's what we're doing. Does anybody have a question? Are we more or less? I'm trying not to talk fast, but I get excited and I do. So please let me know if it seems like I'm mowing through this. Great. Or you're being polite to me. So either way, but we'll advance. So we're going to focus first on just the bottom row. And so for the bottom row, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what is the effect of like this sort of concordant discordant manipulation. So whether or not I basically set it up as so the kind of conclusion of the study is aligned with your beliefs, or like the argument is arguing in the direction of your beliefs. So it's going to be this sort of dichotomous concordant discordant manipulation with how well people perform on the task. So do they get the interpretation of like the 2x2 table correctly? Are they correct? How are they rating the study quality? Things like that. All right. So we're just going to look at the coefficients for that. And the general, there's a lot of stuff happening on this plot, but the general idea is coefficients that are significantly to the right indicate that there's a bias in the direction of what you think is true. So when you think it is in the direction of being more towards what is in line with your identity, you're just going to perform better. And that's basically what we find. These are all just coefficients. I can go into the models later if you're interested, but for the sake of time, these are coefficients representing that bias, as previous literature has shown. And then on the top, I'm just going to give you mean differences in bars, just a different way of looking at that quantity, just for ease of interpretation, if you're interested in the different way of looking at it. So this just basically just confirms that we can replicate across these like 6,500 people across these different paradigms. We're just showing what people have shown in other studies on this interpretation with identity. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the same model, and we're going to have in that model people's identity within it, but we're also going to have the model people's whether or not that is concordant or discordant with their prior beliefs. This is, I think, I said it beforehand, it's sort of this confound feature. We're going to add that to the model and see what we get. And what you see here is that when you add on the top prior beliefs, it either knocks the identity to non-significant, or in this particular case for argument evaluation, you guys need a little bit blurry from my view here, but hopefully you can see it all right. It significantly attenuates it downward, right? And then this up here are just the bars that show the prior relationships, the relationship for concordant, discordant with priors. So this is generally, now we're like up to date now on like what people have shown and published on. We're sort of in the space that we're describing. It seems like these things are confounded, they sort of get in the way, it makes things a bit of a muddled story. That part I've already mentioned to you. So the thing that's different that we're going to try to do is we're going to have a new way of looking at this data in the model. We're going to look at this sort of dichotomous concordant-discordant manipulation on your performance on the task, but we're going to do that only for stuff that has nothing to do with identity, so things that have nothing to do with politics, and particularly also note things that are like not even obviously true. So there's actually not really any good evidence that daily multivitamin use affects your health in any way. People really believe it does, by the way. Like, we could get into actually what the priors are. People overwhelmingly think that vitamins are good for them. But that's actually not necessarily true about the world. And then many other things I'm sort of folding into this category. And what you end up seeing is the relationship is roughly comparable to what I just showed you using identity. And when you plot out, even the bars are a little bit easier to interpret or kind of just like quickly take in. Some relationships are a little bit smaller, some are a little bit larger. So the key thing we want to do is we want to look at for the interaction. We want to get a sense is, okay, what is the coefficient on the interaction term for crossing, is this thing concordant or discordant in the manipulation, and is the topic about identity or not about identity? And again, because a lot's going on here, and I've given you the simple effects for some reason I don't know why, we're just only going to pay attention to the interaction term. Basically, significant coefficients that are to the left, that shows that there actually is more bias when there is no identity content present. Significant interaction to the right means that it's actually going to be a significant interaction showing that there's more bias when it is about identity, and then when it's on the zero, there's no relationship. And what you end up seeing here is that for 4 of the 5, there's either no relationship, there's no sort of effect of identity, and that priors are explaining kind of what's going on here, or it's actually the case that when it's not about politics, people show a bit more bias in the direction of interpreting that sort of paradigm. Now, obviously, for argument evaluation, we still see that there is a small but still like significant effect where the bias is in the direction of identity. We're trying to figure out exactly what's going on there. I think it's really interesting. At the same time, too, those are really hard to control paradigms. I've now run under the hood for this entire presentation. There's like 3 or 4 studies on that like run through with like hundreds of people at a time, sometimes thousands. It's very hard to like figure out exactly like what's driving that feature, except for it's very hard to control those arguments so that they're really well matched. But we're still kind of playing around with some stuff to figure it out. Oh, yeah, and then just the bars to help you kind of walk through it. So this is the non-political effect size, and this is the political effect size. And so try not to hide anything under the hood. It seems pretty clear that there is like, I think the most defendable thing to say is when you take all of it into account, it doesn't seem like there's really much evidence going on for identity when you kind of like look at the entire results as an aggregate. Quick robustness checks. So we can also, that interaction relationship I just showed you here, all this, we can also subset on a couple of different quantities just to kind of as a quick check. So we can look at those with higher prior beliefs. So we subset the analysis to just people who are in like the top 20-25% of priors. We can look at people who have higher quantitative skill. We measure a lot of their performance on a bunch of like quant measures, and just you can use it as a proxy for IQ, but you can also just think about it as people who are more comfortable with like using mathematical reasoning. People who are lower on that construct. people who are higher in partisan identity, so they just are stronger Republicans or Democrats, also just only looking at Democrats, only looking at Republicans, and what you end up seeing is just this is all the same. So for the most part, you see a bunch of cases where there's just no relationship when it comes to identity, or you can see that there's some evidence that identity is actually, it's a non-identity drives a larger bias, and then for argument evaluation, the inverse. Cool, okay, so I have no idea what my time is because I can't keep track of it here, so somebody let me know how far we're going, and I think we're probably 20 minutes left, roughly?
It's 11:37.
11:37, okay, we started a little bit late, so I'm gonna see what I can do on this. General takeaway for study 1 is little to no difference between identity and non-identity content. The context is kind of like identified in argument evaluation, but it's not a well-balanced manipulation. And even when you were to run through, you see very little difference. So even in that effect I'm showing you here, that effect size is quite small. So in the one case you do find it, it's pretty diminished. And so all of this is just kind of suggest, okay, it seems like identity is playing very little to no role, at least in the previous paradigms that people have used. So the next thing we're going to do, and I might move through study 2 a little bit quickly just to kind of preserve some time, is we're going to look at the relationship between motivated reasoning and trait openness. So the extent to which you sort of like are like open or interested in having your identity or your beliefs challenged, or kind of having novel experiences that don't comport with how you think the world works, so on and so forth. So very quickly, there's been a lot of work previously that has made arguments that there is a relationship whereby people who are more open are less likely to engage in motivated reasoning. This is a thing that has been discussed. These studies have not always been well run. They're often have overwhelming correlational work, which people can like push back on, but the correlation work isn't the same thing as strong experimental work. There is some experimental work to show that there's maybe not very much of a relationship. So colleagues and myself have gone through and decided we're going to just try to test this in a more rigorous way, experimentally, to get a sense at what's actually going on between this relationship. And quickly, the reason I'm bringing this up, it might be key, is because if it's the case that there is a relationship where people who are more open and like interested in having their identity challenged do engage in motivated reasoning less, you could say, well, maybe there's something going on here where that's a different way in which identity is sort of like affecting and related to motivated reasoning, right? There's something kind of in this more complicated trait-based dynamic. And so we want to test that and say, okay, is there something there? And maybe we haven't been thinking about this right in this other way. So really quickly, we collect 2,500 individuals, we filter them for attention, we get their demographics, we get their prior belief on different topics. We then measure a kind of individual difference measure across a bunch of different openness scales. So we basically use Big Five, need for closure, these Schwartz values, active open-minded thinking, the same active open-minded thinking AOT, but framed as being about politics. So it's, the questions are more dialed into political content. And then the cognitive reflection test, which you can kind of think for this context as sort of a behavioral measure of being open. That's an oversimplification, but for the sake of the talk, we'll go with that. We then let them alone. We then collect them back several days later, so that there's not people sort of associate this relationship between being asked about how open they are and then engaging in these paradigms. They're randomly assigned again to one of these political identity-oriented topics, and then they're randomly assigned to one of these experimental paradigms. I'm going to move a little bit quicker, but basically the idea is we replicate previous work to show that people perform better on all the paradigms when it is like concordant with their identity. That's just a straightforward replication. We're doing it again, it's straightforward. The thing we want to look at now is what is the interaction between all these different openness constructs on the y-axis and performance on all of these paradigms to represent that kind of bias. And so if we see a coefficient that's shifted to the left, that's the kind of current sort of hypothesized argument, which is that people who are more open are actually going to be less biased. They're going to show less of this sort of like motivated reasoning effect. The other direction would just mean that people who are more open are more biased, and then again, zeros mean nothing, or non-significance. And what you see here for the 2x2 contingency table is just no relationship between openness and any version of openness and that experimental paradigm, and that's true across all the other paradigms as well. In fact, the only places that we do end up seeing a significant relationship in this setup is in the sort of not predicted direction, which is there's small effects that, in some cases, that show that people who are engaging in openness are slightly more willing to engage in motivated reasoning, which is a little bit weird. But when you take across like thinking that you would want to correct for all these multiple comparisons, this is definitely not going to be significant. And there's actually a little something interesting under the hood about sort of like the way in which Democrats want to like signal that they're more open that I think probably is explaining this effect, which is like different than the question at hand. So quickly, little to no relationship between openness and motivated reasoning to the extent we see anything, da-da-da-da. I think I've hit that point, you guys got it. So then we're gonna go to question 3. So this is a little bit more involved, and so I am going to try to walk through it a little bit slower so you guys get a sense, but this is a stronger test of this whole shtick I've been talking about this whole time. So we're gonna try to get like a much like more direct way of testing this. So we're gonna try to change people's prior belief and leave their identity alone. So the actual kind of questions that are being investigated here more concretely, are individuals willing to learn new information that challenges their ideological beliefs? Will this experimentally induced change in prior beliefs actually affects their attitude? That's the core 2 things we want. If you remember back to that goofy toy example I gave in the beginning, it's this idea of like, with people sort of like experience some sort of novel information, does that just kind of get like blocked or just rejected, or is it actually incorporated in? That's the general test. So a little bit more background, because this is going to be a little bit more involved in an experiment. We get a little over 800 individuals. They're all identified as conservative Republicans, and we also refilter them for that when we collect them in. This was collected a couple days right before the 2024 election, up until the morning of the 2024 election. You might think of that as a contentious time in American politics. I'll let you reflect. Basically, this will be important later, everybody who completed the front-end measures, they're preserved in the experiment, and we only lose 4 people due to attrition, and I'll explain later why that is like a key thing, but that's like a certain thing that I'm always like sort of think people should care more about. And for a paradigm like this, you'll see is fairly involved. You want to be careful. So again, the general idea is we need people to like learn new information that they're experiencing in their environment. So that information is going to be in the context of one that challenges their identity. This is going to be, for these conservative Republicans, learning about election integrity and election safety. And then particularly we talk about how the 2020 election was a secure and safe election. Just because I recognize it's not always obvious, this is extremely contentious in the context of American elections for Republicans. Many Republicans think, because of a lot of the content that has been like kind of like communicated to them, that 2020 actually was stolen. And people have oftentimes attributed that to sort of motivated reasoning framework, given how much evidence there is to the contrary. And we're going to like show that that actually is probably not true, that American Republicans are acting pretty rationally. It's just the information environment. Spoiler on what I'm going to show you in a second. And then the control information, you want something that's very, very close in like sort of like topic space. And so what happens here is they're going to learn about the 3 branches of government, but it's going to have no election information in it. So they're going to be spending the whole time learning new information, or information they should have known, probably learned in like middle school, but it's all going to be walking through the way the 3 branches of government work, kind of historical cases. It's going to be fairly well matched, but nothing about elections. Again, glossing over some details, we asked several different items for general credibility in elections. We're just going to fold over that and create one aggregate measure, and then 2020 specifically, same thing. So we're going to work with 2 kind of like quantities for outcomes that we're going to talk about, but they hang together pretty well. The alphas are quite high. And also, it's just repetitive. They do all the same thing for the most part, so it's actually just like better to use them as like aggregates. So this is going to be the design. I'm going to walk through this, and I'm going to ask you at the end if you understand it, because if you don't, none of the rest of the stuff will make any sense, and it's a little bit involved. So we first collect these individuals, we get their demographics, we filter them for basic level of attention, and then we get their pre-treatment attitudes on election integrity and 2020. They're then randomized to either spend 45 minutes to an hour in these sort of complicated modules that have like AI conversations, that have a bunch of different learning tools, that have a bunch of different quizzes, all incentive compatible, so people earn small amounts of money at every stage of this experiment that like walks through to help them learn. And the whole point is basically, we just want you to learn about something new. At the very end of your learning, we're gonna quiz you on what you learned. We're gonna pay you for every right answer you have, but this isn't about your attitude. Like, you can believe whatever you want. But we want to just see how well you can learn this content. So they're either gonna learn about election integrity, or they're going to learn about the 3 branches of government. At the very end, they take their quiz, they're paid money. After all of that, we then just basically say, thank you for doing this. We really want to know like kind of what you think about all this content. We want to ask you some questions about what your thoughts on these topics, and also like how you like the paradigm. And so that's our post-treatment measures. Critically, because online studies for 45 minutes to an hour. A lot of people just like don't want to deal with that. And oftentimes we do a lot of filtering and basically say, hey, look, this is gonna do a study for a while. We don't say the topic. We're just gonna say, it's gonna take a little bit of time. Only take the study if you like have, 45 minutes at least to do it. A bunch of people don't have that time. They sort of miscalculate the time, or people find the topic really unpleasant. They just actually don't want to engage in the topic. What we have throughout all the experiment is we basically say, in a bunch of different places, there's exits. You've already earned some money. You have your show-up fee for showing up to the study, and you've earned money incrementally as you've gone through it. Don't lose the money by closing out the tab. Find an exit and just leave. And when you leave, you just answer a couple quick questions, then you're done. You keep whatever money you've earned up until this point. You could earn more money if you stay and finish the whole thing, but you don't have to. And the reason we're trying to do all of this, and so when they leave, they get the outcomes again. So we preserve random assignment, and we don't have to deal with issues around attrition. We just use an intent to treat model to include all those people in, and we don't have to impute values and make some sort of like modeling assumptions. We basically just know at the point that they left, this is what they believed, and we know what they were randomized to condition-wise. So that's kind of a key thing to preserve that feature. We then 2 weeks later collect them back again. It's after the election and a lot of chaos in the United States. So you do what you want with that, but like we see how that looks and how it endures over time. So that is the overall design. I'm now going to show you what happened from all that. But does anybody have any questions about the design or anything I could clarify? Okay, people are either being polite or I was doing a good job. So we'll see in a second here. Yeah, probably a mixture of both, but yes. All right, so first what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the plot to the left. And basically, what I'm showing you on the x-axis is where people started off. This is going to be their pre-treatment measure. This is only going to be looking at general election integrity. This is the first outcome I want to focus on. More scores to my side at the x-axis indicate they just started off more secure about elections. Scores more to the left means they started off less secure, more insecure about election integrity. On the y-axis is going to show how people have moved as a function of their condition. So if they've gone upward on the y-axis, they've increased in their belief that elections are safe and secure. If they've gone down, they've become less secure, and the dotted line indicates that there's no change between times. And what you see here is that in the control condition, it's effectively hugging that 0 line. It's a little bit higher, which is actually interesting, which suggests that like our control condition actually has a very tiny effect, and you can think about that as also probably eating up some amount of like demand characteristics. There's going to be some amount of people who are just, you're told elections work. We actually had some people writing in saying, I really like your training. I was cool to learn about the 3 branches of government. I kind of get what you're trying to do. I don't think that's going to change anybody's attitudes about the way the elections are secure. And I was like, I'm going to use this in a talk later. Thank you. I appreciate you wrote this in. It's very useful. But the general idea is that like people did good control should be having all these features as the comparison, right? Because we're going to do a comparison not from like the 0 line, we want the comparison from the pink line. So that's the quantity we actually want to look at. The blue line is obviously much higher. People obviously shifted up in their beliefs. Again, this is after they've learned. This is after they've had their money. They're not getting paid for this. This is just sort of an increase. Interestingly, it's in like the lower 2/3 of the distribution, which makes sense mechanically because when you're in the top, it's much harder, there's much less room to move. But also you can think conceptually, these people already were fairly secure, and so they had their beliefs sort of affirmed, which is also nice because it means there's no weird backfire or anything happening here. It's just all moving in a positive direction. And then quickly on this side, we just do like a middle of the scale split. So we say people who started off below the midpoint of the scale and people who started off above the midpoint of the scale, just to kind of make a pretty clear quantity. And what you can see is a Cohen's d for people starting off below the midpoint of 0.9, which is a relatively high Cohen's d in the context of social science. And then even people starting above the midpoint is still a pretty respectable effect size. This all holds true when you look at the beliefs of 2020 election. There's nothing I'm going to say is particularly novel. It's just that that's a harder thing to lift, and that worked relatively well here. And the effect sizes are comparable. Another thing we could note is that when you constrain this sample to like what you might think of as sort of like, sort of jokingly, somebody says racially profiling Republicans. When you constrain it to like a prototypical Republican, like a middle-aged to older white male who voted for Trump in both elections, who has less than less than a graduate degree education, so an undergrad or less, it works quite well. It's actually, those people are represented on the lower end of the distribution anyway. It also works when you identify people who are above the midpoint on a bunch of like political active reports. So people who say they vote more, people who say they are donating more to political charities, things like that. So people who are more politically engaged. We also have a behavioral measure for people who actually like can show higher political knowledge. So it works for those groups too, which you kind of think of as the groups that are more like of interest in this kind of paradigm. Oh, well, I'm doing pretty good on time. which means I'm either talking really quickly, so I'm sorry. The narrative I'm trying to present here is a story about learning. That people receive information, they learn it, and they move forward. That's not the only way you could possibly interpret this data. There's other ways maybe of interpreting it. So this test is a way of trying to get at that in a slightly messy, but I think a pretty fair way. On the x-axis, we have their final quiz score. So it's basically like after you went through all that learning, how well did you sort of report what you learned? And on the y-axis is going to be just a change score. So it's the delta between what they started with to where they moved. So if they're 0, they didn't change at all. If they're south of 0, they changed in a bad direction. And if they're north of 0, they increased their beliefs in election integrity. I'm just going to do the general election integrity. They're identical for both, so I'm not going to waste your time. But the general idea is in the control condition, which is in pink, it's just hugging the line, which makes total sense. The more you learn about the three branches of government, it's done very little to change your attitudes about election integrity. But you see a very clear, and that's irrespective of how much you've learned about the three branches of government. As you learn more about election integrity in the blue, you see just very clear positive slope where they're sort of reporting more. Now, critically, this is a correlational relationship, right? I haven't randomly assigned the amount of learning people are engaging in, but it is consistent with the story of learning. And I wouldn't, if this looked in a different way, if it was basically something to the effect of people in the experimental treatment basically rushed through the treatment. They didn't really learn much, but they at the end were whatever, fine, elections are safe, I'm done, right? That's a sort of not a very good narrative for why, but it would be a way that would look very different in this plot, and we can rule some of those sort of relationships out. And we can say, at the very least, you wouldn't be able to find this if it wasn't a learning story, even though it's imperfect because it's correlational. And then for the sake of time, I'm going to burn through and basically say, we invite people back. We get over 82% of them back. That was 2 weeks later. We impute zeros for everybody who we don't have. So we assume that no change from that original time point before we ever identified them. That's an assumption. You can make other assumptions in this model, and it pretty much all hangs together. This is just this general election on the left, on the right, 2020 election. These are effect sizes I've already shown you. So this is just what it looked like at the point at which they finished their training and gave us the answers. This is what you end up getting 2 weeks later after the election and after what some might describe as chaos. Or at least a lot of interesting kind of intense things. There's sort of two things that are interesting about the plot. One is 2 weeks later and through a lot of stuff, you can really clearly still identify that treatment effect that we got. So this can definitely also do things like ruling out task demands. There's so much stuff that was happening during this time period. Surely they aren't thinking about this random study they took and that we are somehow associated with it weeks later and after lots of people running many studies to try to understand what the hell's going on in the electorate. The second effect, which is weird but kind of interesting, is I think of a Trump winning effect. Basically, Trump winning boosts the control condition up, because all conservative Republicans basically oh, elections are probably safe because he won. And that sort of is the outcome that makes sense to me. This is my narrative. I didn't actually go through and ask anybody. It's sort of you read stuff, you kind of go through the Atlantic or New York, you're trying to get a sense of what exactly is happening. This is consistent with that idea. In the context, more weirdly, in 2020, it seems to his winning pushed down belief in 2020. And the idea here that I have heard that seems plausible is the idea that people say, well, because he won in 2024, it meant he would have won in 2020 if actions weren't sort of preventing him from winning, something of that nature. Not the best logic if you think about it, but still there's a protective effect of the treatment that shows that people are different, meaningfully different, and we can recover that 2 weeks later who went through the training versus people who did not go through that training. So I've basically said that the core takeaway here is that people do in fact actually just incorporate new information. It doesn't change their identities. People are all still conservative Republicans, but they are able to take new information, and it clearly has a measurable and I'd say relatively substantial effect on their belief. They earned $8, maybe $10, and they engage in training for an hour. That's a Cohen's D effectively won for the group you most care about would show that people are actually very happy to incorporate new information into their model, and that isn't something that is sort of damaging, even though it doesn't necessarily comport with their identity. So main things to conclude with: identity seems to play little to no role in past experimental work. There is little to no relationship between being open and engaging in motivated reasoning, and people do learn and incorporate information that challenges their prior beliefs. And with that, thank you. And thank you to all these people on the slide, including Antonio, who is here, who I actually was had a funny line. It was in my notes that I now have lost because I can't say it. But everybody who helped put all these different studies together. So anyway, thank you. I'm very happy to answer any questions people have, particularly things that people didn't find compelling.
Yeah, I have a question, just more regarding your talk.
Like, why was I not on the last slide?
Yeah, what happened?
Yeah,
Where's the
yeah.
funny line? I want to
Yeah.
hear it. No. You mentioned that there were some people who were treated, no? 4 only.
Yeah.
And then you said that there was going to be something that you wanted to talk about those, and I don't know if you mentioned it. Like, what?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to basically indicate that I think that it is important to take attrition really seriously, particularly with these type of experiments, I think in all experiments. And so that was just a flag. In the longer version of that talk, we sort of walk through the ways in which attrition will be threatening that type of experimental paradigm. And so it's just sort of like setting up to say, look, we did all this setup to really kind of preserve causal inference. And through all that process, we only lose 4 individuals. And that was the general take. And you can like impute whatever you want. You can do even Mansky bounds, and everything just holds fine. Because there's only 4 individuals out of like 800 plus.
Also, 80% coming back after 2 weeks is impressive. Good
Yeah,
job.
well, that was a plug for Antonio. Any other questions? Things you don't like about the talk? Things you thought was like unreasonable that I'm claiming?
I have a question, but I was still thinking about it.
Yeah.
Well, in the last experiment that you explained,
Yeah.
you showed that it's possible to change prior beliefs without changing the identity, politic identity.
Yeah.
But couldn't be possible that that belief was changed about the elections without changing the identity, because the belief about the election is not like a core belief about their identity. I mean,
I see.
You can be a conservative Republican without thinking that the 2020 elections was rigged. It's not the same as if you try to change a belief that is a core belief of conservatism. I don't know about abortion or about family traditional values. Because those is necessary to have those beliefs to be a conservative Republican.
Yeah.
But, okay, that's.
I totally understand. I
my
totally.
comment.
It's a good question. So the core point I think I hear you making is like, well, okay, fine. You changed people's beliefs with regard to election integrity, but is that like what it is to be a Republican? Is that really part of like what it is like a Republican's conservative identity? It seems like it's this new thing that Trump kind of like pushed out there and a lot of people around him. And so it could just be identified something that isn't that serious. So it's a very fair question. There's been a lot of, I think, fairly good reporting to show that there's a huge number of individuals that treated this sort of claim that 2020 was stolen, stop the steal, this sort of narrative was sort of used as like a shibboleth, if people are kind of familiar with this term. It was sort of like a way to communicate to people, I'm not only just like a conservative Republican, but I'm like a MAGA conservative Republican. I'm even further entrenched into what it is to be in this political space. That's, I think I can defend it a little bit on that nature, that I think there is evidence that it's very tied to being part of that community. But you're right that it's a very novel thing. And so I've done a slightly worse version of the study with gun control, and the results are not as big, but they are significant and they hold across most of that content. That work is actually published in like Nature Human Behavior, and I'm very happy to send you that paper. It's a smaller effects and it's not as clean, but it's very much working in the context of gun control. We're going to run a much larger study we're trying to finish putting together that includes immigration, gun control, vaccinations, and a couple other things, and try to run this very, very large study that tries to do everything I just described and more across these different topics. And I hope when that paper is done, I can send it to you and you'd be like, all right, fine, fair, that's like pretty reasonable. But yeah, the most I can point to, I think there's quite a lot of popular press work and reporting showing it seemed like people really cared about that and that was important to their identity, but I'm sort of assuming that as part of the experimental kind of paradigm and the theoretical paradigm, and it's fair that like, that's all I can point to. I didn't do that work. A number of Republicans really cared about it. It was very important to them. But it's not exactly the same thing as saying it is like core to their identity. So that's a fair pushback.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, sorry. I was just wondering if with these findings there could be perhaps a program that could be implemented, maybe not right now, but
Yeah.
further, and could this be possible with the current administration in the United States?
Well, you asked two questions there very quickly. To answer your first question, it is totally plausible to find a way. So I get questions kind of like this often, which is basically like, okay, great, fine. You put together this sort of crazy involved paradigm. You did pay people to go through it, but like, how do we actually like use that in the world? And my answer to that is very simple and straightforward, but then massively sort of gummed up to your second part of your question, which is, I think a lot of stuff that people don't appreciate in psychology is that the education system has been massively impressive. Like the effects of education on a human being are just, like, I don't think we have very many like effects that are inside like a person's sort of like psychological mental realm that are as large. And this whole thing is effectively could be described as education just works. Information works, you can just teach people things, and it's totally viable. And we already have an entire, we are currently sitting in an infrastructure that was designed that is a way of communicating very clearly to people how to think about things. It then also requires the governing body to co-sign that, and that is obviously very hard. Something I didn't talk about today that I'm working on that I think is really interesting, and I can, for maybe 1 second, I can just quickly mention, I'm very interested in finding out ways to get people to be motivated to consume information. And one of them I think is like debate. I think debates are interesting. I think people oftentimes like to watch debates online. And so we're trying to go through and develop this whole setup where you can basically test a whole AI system for generating debates organically when you just query it on a topic. So we have this whole setup. We're working in collaboration with a group that basically is trying to bring this to market. They have an app. The app produces AI debates, and we're trying to help them improve it and run some random control trials to show if you make the debate of a certain structure in a certain way, people actually have their beliefs challenged, and they outsource a lot of that thinking to the debaters as they watch it, and they learn from that process, and they moderate their beliefs as a function of learning through that. It's not the same thing as what you asked, which is like a whole system that's set up much like an educational system, which is like kind of my answer. But it's at the very least a way I think that you can get more bottom-up interest in engaging in learning that I think is in line with what people find a little bit more entertaining, and they'll kind of like self-select in. But it's obviously a hard problem, and people much smarter than me have no idea what to do. So anyway, I hope that was a reasonable answer. Yeah. Cheers.
Oh, that's a great idea, actually.
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, I'd love to. Yeah. If you're interested in talking about it, I'm happy to talk about more.
Sure.
Anybody else?
Could you elaborate on the removal of identity? Because I
Yeah,
find
sure.
it hard to think that you can, like, magically modify how one feels about himself or herself, and how do you control whatever is going under the hood?
So is your question, this is for like study one, the whole kind of setup. So you're thinking like, okay, fine, you picked a bunch of topics that like aren't about politics. I take your point, that's like just like straightforwardly true. But is it the case that it isn't also something about people thinking like, I'm a healthy person, I use vitamins, and so I want that to be true, and it's like part of my self-concept. Or like, I think that owning a home is or renting a home is very important, and so my belief is that like you should do that, and I'm the kind of, something of this nature where like, I'm using non-political things, but they're still sort of tethered to identity. Is that part of the question?
Removing identity versus changing mind frame. I think that would be my question.
Got it.
That's a distinction I would make.
Yeah, so the way that study one is set up is it's basically saying, and my answer, if you had said yes, which you didn't, which I take your point, if you'd said yes, I'd be like, well, we asked all these people how important this was, how like, we went through a huge battery for a bunch of these topics, and people just basically think that like taking vitamins or using sunscreen is just like totally unimportant to them and their life and who they are as a person. It's just like a thing that they think is true about the world, and so they use it, and it's like very benign. So I would be able in that context to say, well, clearly these items have nothing to do with identity as described by these people. So I think that's one answer to the question, which is at the very least I'm using stuff that people are saying, these things aren't important to me, I just think they're true. And you still get the same kind of effect sizes as I'm describing. If it's more about how do you, I would be curious if you could elaborate a little bit more on like sort of like this perspective change or something like that. Like what specifically are you thinking?
Right. If I'm a gym rat and you ask me about vitamins, probably I wouldn't be a very good member of your control group.
I got you. Okay. So yeah, it's just that it is sort of this idea that
Right.
some people really care.
Yes, but what I'm thinking is that self-concept is changing the way you're portraying it. It changes very rapidly. Yeah, so is it really identity?
Well, I mean, so
It's different, like in the third study when you focus on a very particular set of individuals who are identified, and they enter the study under that frame of mind, and that's really a self-identification.
got you. So if I had run a study where I had collected all these people and I said, how important is it to you and how you think about yourself to use vitamins, or something of this nature, and I only looked at the people who said not at all, and I compared them, or maybe even more so, across all the different topics. I asked people who don't care at all versus people who do care. Maybe that's a little bit more than this kind of like how they identify themselves. It's hard to do. So the way these paradigms are set up, to do that in the context of politics is kind of hard, because the prior belief is something that is sort of like important for how you sort of implement the whole task. And to have a person say, I really think that like immigration is good for the economy, but I don't care at all about it, it has nothing to do with me, is a pretty hard group to find. That's sort of why at some point I was like, I'm going to start using all these other things that people have very strong priors on all these topics, but it's very, very low on identity. It's true that I didn't subset on people who initially said they didn't care at all, but a vast majority of the distribution is in it's not important to me, it has nothing to do with me. And so it's a little bit getting at kind of what you're asking, but maybe it's not perfect. I could probably do it in a slightly different way. And if you have thoughts, I'd love to hear them on how to run it.
Thank you.
Just thank you.
Anything
else?
¿Alguna otra pregunta, algún otro comentario?
Just
No?
one very quickly, if I can.
You in fact can, yeah.
Follow up on the question raised earlier. I think that you mentioned that you found a smaller effect size in the Nature of Human Behavior paper that you mentioned.
With the gun control.
And might that be related because it's something that they care more about, and therefore...
So very, very good kind of like inference from what I said. I obviously glossed over a lot of stuff. That whole experimental paradigm is much more brutal and boring. And we learned a lot from that paradigm on how to incorporate quizzes to increase learning, how to sort of increase the incentive structure for attention, the fact that people had ideas that they didn't understand about some training, and the AI bot on every module actively worked as like a tutor. So if you're sort of like, I don't understand like why it is that like I've heard all this stuff and you're telling me that like the way this works is X way, we do some work to kind of work through that to provide people with even more information. There's probably other stuff that I could get into. I think it is pretty sufficiently different than like how people identify, and more about like the sort of the overall production quality is much higher in this latter training. I think also one thing that we learned from that first one is we basically try to move people to the middle. So the idea being that like a lot of information with gun control in regards to the United States is really mixed. It's actually like a pretty complicated topic. There's evidence that like in certain quadrants of social space, like access to guns like actually does keep certain people actually relatively safe, like women in rural areas is an example of this. And in other cases, it's extremely like destructive to people's well-being. Urban centers for like low-income ethnic minority men, it's like massively detrimental. The way gun control works versus access to illegal guns. It's a very complicated topic. It was one that I was interested in testing because it actually really lends itself to a lot of educational intervention. People can learn a lot from it, and it tend to move people more towards the middle. And I think in this one, the way we had set it up, it was basically doing a lot of work that also had like an affirming quality. We did a lot of work to also make sure people learned content, as in the gun control, that they felt was like affirming to like what they thought was probably going on and true, but still the overwhelming evidence was like, but it's still the case that these things are safe and secure and fair. And I think that sort of more unified message made it a little bit easier for people to kind of move in a direction versus another message originally, which is sort of like, hey, you're really confident about this topic, but this topic's really complicated and you should like maybe consider really learning this stuff and pushing through. So again, is it more about identity in one versus the other versus like the smoothness and kind of professionalism of the paradigm, and also the fact that like we picked a topic in this latter case that was much easier to point to like a direct conclusion to get people to move to? I don't know. It's still open. We're hoping to actually address all this. The study that we're going to run has actually this interleaved versus blocked feature and like this directional feature. So we're ideally going to run something that's going to get at all of that once we finish building it, which is why I'm not sleeping.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you so much. 12:12. That's about for you.
La siguiente plática a las 12:30. We're scheduled for your talk
Yes.
at 12:30.
Oh, perfect.
Oh.
So we have some time and en beneficio de los que están conectados empezamos y que hayan pensado estar a las 12:30, nos vamos a esperar. Okay?
Gracias.
Perfecto. Yeah. Thank you so much. Besides to
I really think that was a very good question because when
That was a good question.
Yeah, when you do that big study with different effects, you will probably gonna see that.
Some political identities. Well, I think.
No, it's a good question. We check.
For example, I think that to be in favor of
Bueno, vamos a retomar nuestra sesión, ¿no? Y quisiera presentar a Joshua White, que es un científico computacional cognitivo y social. Acaba de iniciar sus estudios doctorales en la Escuela de Administración y Dirección de Empresas Sloan del MIT, y sus intereses están en los fundamentos computacionales de la cognición moral humana, la forma en que los valores morales y las creencias profundamente arraigadas pueden cambiar con el tiempo, incluyendo cómo predecir e influir en estos cambios mediante la persuasión moral, y también le interesa la toma de decisiones en general. En particular, estudia la cognición moral con base en el contractualismo descriptivo, que supongo que es parte de lo que nos va a estar hablando el día de hoy. Y este contractualismo es una teoría que considera la cognición moral como acuerdos reales o hipotéticos entre agentes para garantizar beneficios mutuos, y lo hace utilizando modelos computacionales, experimentos y conceptos de teoría de juegos. Sin más, le damos la bienvenida a Josh, quien nos va a hablar sobre AI, Persuasion, Prosociality and Politics, Value Change via AI Human Dialogues. Persuasión con la inteligencia artificial, prosocialidad y política, cambio de valores por medio de diálogos, ser humano, inteligencia artificial. Démosle la bienvenida a Josh White. Muchas gracias por tu presencia aquí.
Buenos días. Muchas gracias por la presentación. I'll speak in English now because my Spanish isn't very good, particularly when I'm nervous. So firstly, apologies. You had one fast talker and now you're going to have a weird talker because I've got an Australian accent. So I hope you can understand me, but I'll try to do it slowly. So yes, thanks very much for having us. It's a real honour to be here. So I'm going to be speaking today about a few different related projects that all look at using AI human dialogues to try to change people's fundamental values and deeply held beliefs. Now, I was going to introduce myself, but it's already been done so nicely for me, so I'm going to skip right through to today's talk. So the first thing to start with is that people's values and deeply held beliefs don't change overnight. That's almost definitionally the case. And when I talk about values today, I'm going to use the term very broadly to mean that value is a relatively stable preference or priority that guides how people evaluate trade-offs and make choices, especially in domains where where stakes are normative, social, or political. So I'm going to use that word value very broadly. But again, in that definition, I'm making it clear there that the preferences are relatively stable. They're relatively stable preferences and priorities. So they don't tend to change that much. Our deeply held values, we tend to hold on to them for quite some time. But they do change, and we have lots of examples. In the last 10, 20 years, a lot of people's moral values about the LGBT community, gay marriage, all those things has changed quite a lot. In a similar sense, people's attitudes towards factory farming and eating meats has changed quite a lot. Veganism, had anyone even heard of that word 50 years ago? And now it's a somewhat common phenomenon. Even things like religious beliefs. While a lot of people will hold on to their religious beliefs for their whole life, people do change those. Nick, who just spoke, actually has a paper which shows that in the US, about 30% of people over their lifetime at least have some sort of change in their religious beliefs. And even politics. So, people don't tend to change their politics that much, but there are famous examples. And you probably all know examples in your own life of when maybe you've changed your political opinions or people you know. But famous examples like Ronald Reagan was originally a Democrat and didn't just change parties, but changed his political opinions about the role of the state and the role of the free markets. Elizabeth Warren, a senator from the US as well, basically did the opposite. She was a Republican, free market believer who really changed stance and became a sort of a quite progressive Democrat. So the point is, these fundamental values that we hold may be hard to change, but they do change over time. And one of the things I'm interested in is how this happens, and in particular how we might be able to sort of persuade or try to push that process towards happening. And so today's talk, I'm going to present two projects that I've been working on that suggest that lasting value persuasion can occur, in particular with evidence and fact-based argumentations. And in the studies we're looking at them when they've been delivered via human AI dialogues, so they can be done at scale. So in some sense, what I'm going to be presenting today is very related to what Nick's been talking about in sort of rational argumentation and thinking about things not necessarily from identity point of view, but from sort of actually doing the reasoning about these sort of deeply held beliefs. So the first project I'm going to be looking at is increasing donations to effective charities using human AI dialogues. In that study, we find that human AI dialogues can increase donations to an effective charity by 45%, and that a static message that also emphasised, that made arguments about charity effectiveness could increase donations by 17%. Then the second project I'm going to present is looking at persuading voters in political domains using human AI dialogues. And in this study, we find that US participants can be moved 2% more likely to vote for Trump or Harris after they talk with an artificial intelligence that is either pro-Trump or pro-Harris. So basically, we're saying we can move people's likelihood of voting for candidates by having a persuasive conversation with AIs that have been sort of developed to persuade them in that direction. We find that after 4 weeks, we contact people and find that 30% of the effect persists, so it's somewhat stable over time. And we find that the persuasion is due to fact-based argumentation, and it's mainly the facts that are being used to change people's minds, not sort of emotion or other sorts of psychological techniques, and the personalisation to each individual seems to be helping as well. We replicate this, we did it in the US originally, it's replicated in Canada and Poland, and we sort of even looked at another domain that wasn't sort of presidential politics, but was looking at a more local, less polarised issue in which we saw much larger effect sizes of persuasion of these values. In particular, looking at a Massachusetts referendum on whether we should legalise psychedelics for therapy. So, I'm going to move on to this first project, which is increasing charitable donations to effective charities with human AI dialogues. Now, the first thing to note here is that not all charities are created equal. Some charities are much more effective than others. And in fact, this is a study from one of my collaborators, a previous study from one of theirs, that actually tries to plot the distribution of how effective different charities are. And what you can find is there's a very skewed distribution where the most effective charities tend to be orders of magnitude more effective than the average charity. Now, here, there's a lot of questions about effectiveness. In this case, we're talking about cost effectiveness. And so in particular domains, if you're looking at sort of global health outcomes, you can think about how many lives saved per dollar, for example, as how effective it is. And that's what I'm referring to here. And these ideas have sort of spawned this whole movement called effective altruism, which is basically people who are really interested in doing good for the world in a rational way, in a way that you can do the most good per dollar spent. And so there's these very famous books by Will MacAskill and Peter Singer, which have sort of made these arguments. And part of that process is basically doing a very rational evaluation of charities. So basically, you need to do the science or do the data analysis to see, for each charity, how much does it cost per life saved? And this is where institutions like GiveWell have arisen up. And GiveWell is a charity evaluator. Its whole mission is basically just to evaluate charities and to see how good they are at saving lives, etc., per dollar spent. And what GiveWell has done is they've got about 4 or 5 charities which they recommend as sort of the 4 or 5 charities that are the most effective per dollar spent. And one of those is the Against Malaria Foundation, which is what I'm going to be talking about later, so I want to introduce it to you now. So the Against Malaria Foundation is a charity that provides bed nets to people that are treated with insecticides that are given to people in sub-Saharan Africa. And basically, they've done all the analysis. They say that it costs about $6 to provide one net, and that if you look at how many nets can be given out, that ends up averaging across averaging about $5,500 per life saved. And so, according to GiveWell, and these people, their whole sort of life is trying to evaluate how effective these charities are. This is sort of one of the most effective charities in the world in terms of dollars spent per life saved. So this is this whole idea of effective charitable giving that I'll be talking about today. But there's a problem with all of this, is besides sort of a small subset of people, it's not very natural, and most people don't really think about charitable giving in these effectiveness terms. So, for example, in the US, Americans donate approximately 2% of their GDP to charity, but there really isn't any correlation between how effective a charity is and its popularity. And there's been a lot of research and lots of theorizing in psychology and economics, etc., about why this is the case. And I'm just going to quickly go over a few ideas, because this isn't the point of my talk, but it's been theorized that because giving is a heavily emotional process, that it doesn't really act very well on reasons and arguments. And you can maybe see this by the fact that when people are trying to get donations, they often use very emotion-laden images of poor children or people in bad situations, and they use that to try to persuade people to give. So maybe that's why it's really hard to use the rational part of the brain to get people to give to these effective charities, which might not be as emotionally appealing. And this is a related concept, but that the empathy evolved in these close-knit groups, and so maybe empathy works well for those around you that you can see, that helping them might not be as effective as helping somebody across the world, and it might be quite hard then to sort of overcome that. And then there's some other game theoretic reasons that have been proposed about this. But the main point is that it's really hard, and so we don't naturally do this effective giving thing and give to the most effective charities. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how can we try to improve that? How can we try to increase effective giving? And so there's been decades of research that have looked at the general question of how you can persuade people or get people to give more money overall, but much less research has looked into how to increase effective giving. So it's not just how to give more of your money, but how to redirect where that money is given to the more effective of the charities. Some research has shown that using things like nudges can increase effective giving. In some cases, just information provision can increase effective giving. So simply just saying, telling people who already value effectiveness and saying, hey, by the way, if you gave your money to this charity, it would be more effective, it would save more lives. In some cases, that's all you need to do to persuade people to give to a more effective charity. And there's basically a dominant narrative that has been sort of played out in the psychology literature is that effective giving is extremely difficult because of the reasons I mentioned before, the emotional and empathy-driven nature of it. And so under this view, providing information, providing arguments really shouldn't work very well. Reasons and facts aren't really what people are maximising or what they're doing when they're giving to charity. And so that they should be unlikely to work very well at persuading people to give to more effective charities. But this could be a limitation of our persuasive tools rather than a fundamental aspect of human cognition. And so we have these new tools now, these crazy machines that we can speak to, and who would have thought we would have been here 5 years ago. But we have these tools that we can use that can really target individual arguments and target reasons to particular people, and who have all the information out there in the world that they can search. And so the idea is that maybe with these human LLM dialogues, we can actually do a better job of persuading people to give to more effective charities than previously people would do naturally. And there's a lot of evidence now coming out, that more of this research is coming out day in, day out, that LLMs have been shown to be as, or in many cases, more persuasive than humans in a variety of domains. People have looked at climate change, conspiracy theories, veganism, like lots of these different spheres. People have looked at whether having conversations with large language models can persuade people to change their mind, and generally it's shown to be similar to human performance, if not better. And so one of the goals of this study is to see whether we can apply this same logic, apply the ability of the LLMs to personalize treatment to individual reasons, for their ability to have this vast amount of information that they can marshal at any stage to individuals, and see whether we can use this at scale to provide people with reasons, evidence, and facts that might change their mind or help them persuade them to give to a more effective charity. And so we devise an experiment to see if we can do this. The way we do this, we have participants come into the lab. We have about 1,000 people that come into the lab. So they come into the lab on their computer. It's online. I don't know why I said that. Metaphorically, they come into the lab. We give them $1. We say, you're going to have $1 for this experiment, and we tell them that this dollar will be given on their behalf to a charity of their choice, whatever charity they choose. Then we ask them a bunch of questions, just free text. We ask them to type it, about their charitable attitudes. We ask them, why is it their favourite charity? What's your favourite charity? And why do you give to charity in general? Then we ask them, we basically make them split their donation between their favourites charity and the Against Malaria Foundation, which is the one I introduced earlier, which is the super effective charity. So basically participants, if they want, they can say 100% goes to my favourite charity and 0 to this Against Malaria Foundation I've never heard about. Then after that, the participants are put in 3 different conditions. The first is a control condition, where participants have an irrelevant conversation with a back and forth conversation with an AI about dogs and cats. So really, talking about dogs and cats shouldn't change your charitable preferences or actions. Then in the next one, we have a static message, which is a message that has been given to all participants equally. So it's not a personalised back and forth AI dialogue that tries to persuade them to give to the Against Malaria Foundation rather than their favourite charity. And the last condition, which is of the most interest to us, is the full AI human dialogue persuasive condition. And in this case, we feed the bots with all the participants' reasons. We tell them what their favourite charity is. We ask them why. We tell the bot why it was their favourite charity. We give all that information to the bot and tell it to persuade them as effectively as possible to give as much money as possible to the Against Malaria Foundation. So, and then we measure it again. So we have a nice pre-post difference. We can see how much, and we have randomization between conditions. We can see how much the AI-LM conversation, the AI-human conversation can increase donation to the Against Malaria Foundation, to our effective charity. We also have 2 other secondary outcome measures. One is a moral belief change. So we ask people pre and post treatments for their agreement on a 0 to 100 scale that not giving to charity is morally wrong. So here we're trying to test whether maybe this conversation can change not just their specific behaviour about charity, but might change some of their fundamental moral beliefs about different related but different constructs. We're interested to see whether the conversations might have some transfer effects and not just affect the particular donation allocation, but sort of their ways of thinking about charity and what's right and wrong. And we have another measure which we get people to, we have a click-through button at the end of the survey where we say, click on this button to donate your own money to the AMF. So that's meant to be a measure of future donation intent, hoping that maybe we can sort of, we can get people to click more and give their own money, which is ideal, not just give the money that we gave them. So I want to give you a really quick example so you can get an idea of what's happening, and then I'm going to show some results. So this is an example. This is a real example of a person. So this person came in. We asked them what's their favourite charity, and they said the Make-A-Wish Foundation. I don't know if you have, I'm assuming you have that in Mexico, maybe? What's that?
That's children with cancer?
Yes, yeah, or children with, it basically it gives children who are terminally ill, they have some wish to maybe meet a football player or to do something good before they might pass, and then they allow that wish to happen for that child. So in terms of an effective charity, it probably doesn't, in the way I'm thinking about effectiveness in this paper, it's not a very effective charity. You're not saving lots of lives per dollar spent compared to some of the other charities. And we ask them, why is it their favourite charity? And it says, because it fulfills children's wishes who likely will not live because of illness. And then we ask them why do they donate, and they say to make a difference. Then, before treatment, they said, hey, it's my favourite charity, I want to give 100% of that money to the Make-A-Wish Foundation and 0 to the Against Malaria Foundation. Then they get a response from the chatbot, which basically says, I understand your passion for Make-A-Wish Foundation and the incredible joy it brings to children. However, I urge you to consider the immense impact your donation could have if given to the Against Malaria Foundation, which is known for its cost effectiveness in saving and improving lives. So basically, you can see here how the LLM is sort of giving a very persuasive argument as to why it might be better to give the money to the Against Malaria Foundation rather than their favourite charity of the Make-A-Wish. And this becomes a back and forth conversation. So in this case, the participant responds, I'd be willing to reconsider, but wonder about the needs of terminal children. And in this case, it responds back and says, the AI responds back and says it's understandable to be concerned about the needs of terminally ill children. The Make-A-Wish Foundation does exceptional work. However, one way to think about this is by considering the broader goal of supporting children's health and well-being could be addressed. So it's basically making the argument that if you care about helping children with illnesses, well, the Against Malaria Foundation allows you to help more children with illnesses per the same dollar spent. So basically, I just want to give you an idea of what sort of happens in this back and forth conversation. So in this case, then he asks for facts and information about how the Against Malaria Foundation directly helps children. And in response, again, this is a great thing about the bot, is it has all the information out there in the world and basically gives a bunch of information about what it does and how that helps children. And then at the end of this case, this person then decided to split their donation 50-50. So after the persuasive conversation, they then gave equal monies to each. Then the other condition we have is the static treatment. In this case, we want to see whether how much of the effect might be due to the back and forth conversation and the sort of personalising aspect of the individual versus how much is just the general persuasive argument that's the same for everybody. So in this case, participants basically see this general argument that is that's written to everybody equally, that tries to argue for giving to the Against Malaria Foundation because of how effective it is, because of how many lives it saves per dollar. And then the control, like I said, was an irrelevant conversation about cats and dogs. All right, is there any questions about the paradigm or thoughts before I go into some results? All right, let's hit it. So, the control condition. So on the x-axis here, I have the donation change. So that's the average post-donation minus the pre-score donation. In the control condition, we see no difference, which is good. Cats and dogs doesn't increase people's donations at all. In the static message, we do see a significant change. We see about 8 cents on the dollar. By seeing that static message, people donate more money to the Against Malaria Foundation, and it's about 27% from the original donation amount. Then even more so, what we see is that the LLM conversation increases donations to the AMF by about 12 cents, which is about a 45% increase. And just, we look at this across the distribution of pre-treatment donations. So on the x-axis on this graph here, we have the original donation. So and we have a histogram at the top showing what people's initial donation split was. You can see that most people either chose originally to give 0 cents to the Against Malaria Foundation or chose to split it 50-50. But what you can see, regardless of what the participant's original donation allocation, we see the largest treatment effect for the persuasive LLM conversation, and we see also an effect for the static message, and the control in none of the cases makes any difference. Of course, in this last condition here, it's when there's, similar to one of the studies Nick's mentioned, is we have ceiling effects. So if you're already giving 100 cents to Against Malaria Foundation, it's impossible to give any more cents in our study design. So the fact that we see null treatment effects there is expected. Okay, so we were also interested in looking at the extent to which it changed other variables. So we also looked at the moral belief change. So this is the change in participants' belief that not giving to charity is morally wrong. So we look at our two comparisons. So the static treatment minus the control, there's no difference. So there was no significant change in the moral beliefs. Whereas if you look at the LLM conversation minus the control, you can see there is a small and significant effect. So on average, participants in the LLM condition endorsed this statement that not giving to charity is morally wrong 1.1 points more on a 100-point scale. So it is a small effect, but it is real. And this is maybe indicating that there's some sort of value change that's undergoing, and not just sort of persuasion on behaviour. And the other thing we looked at was the click-through rate, which was whether people would click through to donate their own money. In this case, it looks like we have an effect where the static message and the LLM conversation show about 9% or so, and the control condition shows about 7% of people click through. It's not significant, but partly because we don't have as much power for this analysis because it's not a pre-post design. Okay. So basically, we've got some evidence that our AI persuasive conversations did change people's behaviour and their values. But what we don't know from looking at this is why. Like, what did it do that was persuasive? It's one thing to know that it worked, and that might be helpful for thinking about designing tools in the world or designing interventions, but it's really important for us to know like, why it worked. Now, in this study, we can't say with certainty because we didn't randomise different strategies. But we do have two pieces of suggestive evidence that we explore. We have a lot of treatment effect moderators. So before people did the experiment, we asked them lots of questions about their political beliefs, about their actively open-minded thinking, their moral beliefs, etc. And we can see that if the effects differ for different sorts of people or for different sorts of charities, that might give us an idea about what is happening underneath the hood. The other thing we can do is we can do a correlational analysis where we can try to see which features of the conversations, because we have all the conversation text, and we can do natural language processing to try to see, to try to extract features from those conversations and see which features are most predictive of donation change. Now, this is just only a correlational analysis. But we do what we can to control for endogeneity by controlling for the type of charity. And we have a lot of controls, but we're not saying this is a fully causal analysis. But it does give us some insights into what's happening. The first thing we look at is treatment effect heterogeneity. So these are results from including all of our pre-treatment covariates in a causal forest, and it gives you the variable importance of each of the variables. So basically what that's saying is just how much does each of those variables explain differences in treatment effects across individuals. And sort of what we can see qualitatively is there's a big spike for these four measures which seem to explain quite a lot of the variability in treatment effects, which is the pre-treatment score, revenue, the mean actively open-minded thinking scale, and the Oxford Utilitarian Scale. This is a subscale called impartial beneficence. And what we then did was use generalized additive models to try and see how those effects differed across that covariate. So I'm going to skip through that one because it's not that interesting, but the second one here is more interesting. So open-minded thinking was something that Nick mentioned in his talk. This is a scale where basically it's like a 6-point scale where participants endorse how much they believe they should change their mind when they hear new evidence, and things like that. So it's basically an endorsement that changing your mind is a good thing to do in light of new evidence and reasons. And what we see, so we have the red line is the control. So the control condition, the pre-post change is the same regardless of how open-minded thinking you are. For the static message, it's pretty much the same as well. There's no real treatment effect heterogeneity. What we do see for the LLM conversation is, now there's a bit of non-linearity, but that is mainly to do with the data support. So I wouldn't read too much into the non-linearity. But for the middle of the distribution, where we have lots of data, it's monotonic. You see that the more open-minded to thinking about evidence somebody is, the larger their treatment effect. And that goes from around 10 cents or so maybe slightly less than that, when they're sort of low open-minded thinking, to 25 cents if they're quite high in open-minded thinking. And we see a similar result for utilitarianism. So this is a subscale of the utilitarian, Oxford Utilitarian Scale, which looks at impartial beneficence, which is the idea that everybody's utility or value should be treated equally, and you should be impartial towards those. And we see a very similar pattern where there's no treatment effect moderation in the control or the static groups, but there's a massive treatment effect, massive treatment effect moderation for the persuasive conversation, where the more utilitarian you are, the more you endorse this idea of impartial beneficence, the larger your treatment effect, the larger your donation change. And so reading these two things together, what we can read is that these treatments work the best for people who care about evidence, who care about facts and reasons, and for people who are already sort of utilitarian inspired and care about effectiveness in this sort of utilitarian, effective altruist sort of way. And so basically by looking at this, we're sort of getting a bit of a picture of what's going on underneath the hood. It's that facts and evidence are really what helps makes this treatment work, what increases donations much more. Although, in saying that, it still works for everybody. So even at the lowest end of utilitarianism or the lowest end of the open-minded thinking scale, there's still positive treatment effects for the treatment. I'm going to skip that. Now, the other thing we looked into was how accurate the AI was. One of the things we were worried about was, okay, maybe the AI is just lying to everybody, and that's how it's persuading people, by just making up facts. Now, we prompted the bot not to do this, but as we all know with these large language models, they can hallucinate. We can't control what they do exactly. So to do this, we had a two-stage natural language processing pipeline. We first classified which round of the conversation included factual assertions, and then we used 3 separate search-enabled LLMs to rate the factual accuracy of each of those claims on the scale from 0 to 100. What you find there is that, so on the x-axis we have the different rounds of the conversation. So you see that across all the rounds, the AI says that were generally very accurate, mean scores above 90. The AIs get more accurate over time. So this is good news. And lastly, we looked at a correlation between accuracy and the donation change, the main outcome variable. And it does show a significant correlational increase. So the more accurate, the better a job it did at persuading people to give more money to the effective charity. Okay, now this next analysis is probably the one which tries to tell us, get the most information as what persuasive strategies are being used by these bots, and to try to find out which are the most effective. So we have a 3-stage pipeline. We first get a set of 25 different arguments or strategies that have been used in the literature on charitable persuasion. We then get each conversation, we have the text, we get 5 independent LLM models to rate each of those conversations for how much each persuasive strategy or argument was used. So we get a nice rating of how much each was used, and then we use some just general regression modeling to see how well each strategy does at predicting the donation change. So I might skip some of these details in the interest of time, but the strategy set basically comes mainly from the literature, but also from some LLM prompts as well. Then we get this final, it might be a little hard to read it particularly well, unfortunately, but then we get this final list of 25 different strategies that we use. So for example, we can see right at the bottom, there's a strategy of of avoiding regret, which is trying to invite consideration of which choice you'll feel proudest about later. Or then an important one, 3 above that, is effectiveness framing, which is just highlighting the lives saved or improved per dollar donated. So we have all these different strategies. Then we get a measure of how much that was used. So we can see that on the x-axis here we have not used at all, used minimally in the conversation, used moderately, or used extensively. And then we have the distribution across all those different LLM ratings of how much each strategy was used. And so what we can sort of see is that the effectiveness framing and gain frame messaging were used some of the most. They were used in nearly all conversations. Whereas some strategies like peak pricing, which is basically trying to use odd amounts, 17 cents, to grab attention and persuade, that was never used basically. And guilt appeals as well was never used. So we get an idea of what strategies were used by the AI. And then what we do is like I said, we try to predict the donation change using those ratings. Now I'm going to just focus on the ones that are significant on either end. And so we find that basically the main ones to look at here is effectiveness framing, gained frame messaging. These have very large effects in about 10 cents per extra rating in increasing the donation change. And so this again is adding to the whole story of the study I'm trying to tell, which is that it's these fact-based arguments that tend to do a lot of the one that the model is using a lot. It's using a lot of fact-based arguments about effectiveness and things like that. Even transparency, that's about all the facts, audits, reports, and donor verification. These are being used, and they're being very predictive of increased donation change. So to conclude this study, basically if we find the effective giving bot increases donations by 45% compared to control, 17% compared to the static message, it increased participants' belief that not giving to charity is morally wrong, which might be an indication of value change. Despite some heterogeneity, it works for all major charities, regardless of their population, subject, or geographical scope. I didn't actually show those analyses here. And we had larger treatment effects for more utilitarian people and who were more open-minded to evidence. Overall, the model was accurate, and greater accuracy predicted greater donation change. And the positive messages, like emphasizing effectiveness and gain frame messages, showed that showed large correlation with donation change. And so this is evidence that there's multiple paths to persuasion, that sort of belief change and value change seem to be occurring, and that we have the biggest effects for individuals who already value effectiveness and who care about evaluating evidence open-mindedly. And so basically, together this is really pushing, it's consistent with the account that individuals can be persuaded with rational argumentation to give more effectively, and it really pushes back against this dominant narrative in some of the charitable giving literature in social psychology that says that giving is about emotion and is insensitive to reasons and evidence. So that's the main finding for this paper. And these are my fabulous co-authors. So I'm going to quickly move on to the next study we did, which is got a very, very similar setup, so I won't have to walk through the details as much. I can get straight to the results. So this paper is called Persuading Voters with Human AI Dialogues. Now, this is work mainly done very heavily by House Lin. I was part of this project, but I'm not saying I did most of it by any means. Very far from it, but I was part of the group, and it is coming out in Nature tomorrow. So if anyone wants to read this paper, keep an eye out for that. I think it comes out around 1 o'clock or something. So basically, there's been lots of talk about how AI puts elections at risk, and how AI might be able to persuade people to vote for different candidates and could be used by bad actors to persuade and change election outcomes. But we might wonder how big of an effect this really is. As I was saying earlier, people don't tend to change their opinions about about politics and these deeply held values that often, even though it does happen. So we might wonder how big of an issue this really is. So for example, the political persuasion literature often shows that there's really small effects on candidate preference by about 1 percentage point or smaller. So, if humans' best attempts at persuasion can only move people 1%, should we be that worried about what AI can do in this case? And there's evidence to show that that AI-generated messages are often similarly persuasive than humans, sometimes a bit more, but not in different ballparks. So maybe attitudes of voters about high-stakes elections are not movable. These are fundamental values. They're deeply held beliefs that it's pretty hard to change with a simple ad or a simple conversation, for example. On the other hand, though, there's been a growing literature, like what I just presented, like other papers here, that shows that human-AI dialogues are really effective and more persuasive than static AI-generated messages at persuading people. And there's more and more literature saying that human-AI dialogues have been working for these cases of resistance, entrenched beliefs about deeply held values, etc., etc. Like what I just presented, like a paper by Tom Costello, who was one of my co-authors, about using AI dialogue to reduce conspiracy theory beliefs, etc. And so basically, we use a very similar design to what I had before, where we have chatbots being randomized to persuade people about political opinions, to see to see the effects that AI might have in persuading these sort of deeply held beliefs about political outcomes in this election context. So basically, the first study I'm going to report is about the US presidential election. We have a randomized controls trial. We get 2,500 Americans, and we randomize them to speak with either a pro-Harris or pro-Trump chatbot. They had conversations that lasted around 6 to 10 minutes with those chatbots. And we used, similar to my paper, we used ChatGPT 4.0. In this case, we also used Perplexity, so we had search capability. But we just used the frontier AI models to make these sort of chatbots. And we measured people's preference for each candidate on a 0 to 100 scale, their likelihood of voting for that candidate, and their vote choice. This is an example. I'm going to quickly skip over it because it's the same sort of thing as we saw in the previous study. It's a sort of a reasons and evidence-based conversation that the bot is having here, trying to argue with this particular person why they should vote for pro-Trump, basically. Okay, so what results do we find? So basically, I'm going to show you two different dot plots, or two different dots. We have the blue, which is the pro-Harris AI. So basically, that bot has been prompted to argue in favour of Kamala Harris, that they should vote for Kamala Harris. And the pro-Trump bot has been prompted to argue to individuals that they should vote for Trump. What we find is that for people who are already Trump supporters, a pro-Trump AI doesn't really move them very much. They're already a Trump supporter. There probably isn't much to happen. But if a Trump supporter receives a pro-Harris AI message, they can move by about 3 points on a 100-point scale of their preference for the two candidates. And we see pretty much the reverse pattern for Harris supporters. So people who came into the study already supporting Harris, if you gave them a pro-Harris AI, they didn't really change their opinions on average. If you gave them a pro-Trump, they became more favourable towards Donald Trump. So basically, we're seeing here evidence of persuasion around these sort of political candidate choice. We also did this, so the previous measure, it's a similar measure, that was a 0 to 100 scale, where 100 is pro-Kamala and 0 is pro-Trump. In this case, we asked them the probability that they're going to vote for each candidate. And so this measure is meant to be not just about their general evaluation and feelings towards the candidates, but about their actual self-reported likelihood of voting, which might be more relevant to the actual election, possibly. And here we find the same thing, basically. The pro-Trump AI makes people more likely to vote for Trump. The pro-Harris AI makes people more likely to vote for Kamala Harris. Now, we did a very similar thing to my study, where we wanted to find out why, what strategies are being used, why is this persuasion happening, where we basically got a list of different strategies and then got them to be rated again by different LLMs as how much each strategy was used. And there's two strategies in particular I'm going to talk about. Again, this whole talk has been about how evidence and facts seem to work really well. So you can see that evidence and facts were used in 65% of conversations. The other one we're going to look at is personalization, which was used a bit less often, but in 20% of the conversations. So what we did, very similar to my study, we did a regression to see how much these different strategy use predicts the change in candidate preference. In this case, because we had like 27 different things, and we used a lasso model, which basically drops to 0 irrelevant factors, and found good evidence that both personalization and evidence and facts predicted greater belief change or candidate preference change. But similar to my study, this is correlational, right? We haven't randomized the use of these strategies. It could be that these strategies are used in response to different sorts of people or in different sorts of cases. And so we can't draw really too much causally into this. So what did we do? We did the same experiments, but in the Canadian election, because basically we got some reviews back and the Canadian election was about 2 weeks later. So we went, okay, now we want to do a causal test. So we did the same thing, but we have Mark Carney, the Liberal, the sort of the left-wing candidate, Pierre Poilievre, the right-wing candidate. Exact same setup, but in Canada. But in this case, we have 2 different prompts. One is the baseline, and by baseline that means it's the same prompt as the original study. The second is a no facts condition. So we're trying to experimentally manipulate whether the model is using facts and evidence to do the persuasion. And we want to see the difference between those. So what we see is similar patterns from before, but most interestingly, the effects are bigger for the baseline condition, where they're using facts and evidence, than in the no facts condition, where we've sort of prompted the AI not to use facts and evidence at all. And this is the same regardless of the direction of if someone's pro-Poilievre or pro-Carney. But basically all this is trying to show is this is some causal evidence of what we showed before and what I showed in my study, that facts and evidence seem to be working, that there's actually something causal going on here. We actually randomized and manipulated the different strategies that the AI has used. Then we also did this in Poland as well, because we had someone who spoke Polish in our team, and they also had an election coming up very soon. So same thing, you have to excuse my Polish, Trzaskowski, which is the left-wing candidate, and Nawrocki, the right-wing candidate, and we get basically the same results. You can persuade people in the direction of the AI, and the effect is smaller, in all cases there's a significance, than when you don't use the facts and evidence, like you see there. I'm not going to move to talk about the personalization stuff, I don't think. And then, so basically, all the previous studies have been in similar contexts. They've been about national races, about presidential, or in Canada's case, prime ministerial elections. And they're thought to be very politicized, people know a lot about them, etc. What we were interested in was whether we could have different persuasion, maybe possibly more persuasion, for more local, less polarized settings. So we ran the same paradigm. People talk to bots, but about a ballot measure in Massachusetts that was seeking to legalize using psychedelics in therapy. And this is an issue which a lot of people don't necessarily have strong opinions about, possibly, or they might not know a lot of facts about it. It's certainly not as sort of out there in the culture as something like a presidential election in the US. The whole world knows all about the US election. But things like, these sort of more local issues are much less out there. So same thing. We have an AI model that's meant to persuade participants that yes, that you should vote for legalizing psychedelics in Massachusetts, and we have one bot which is randomized to argue people that no, you shouldn't have psychedelics in therapy in Massachusetts. Now, the design is slightly different. We separate the people into their initial beliefs. So if somebody was previously a strong supporter of psychedelics, of this measure, we either randomize them into the vote no, so that they should vote no, they should vote against the measure, or a control group, which is a similar control group we had before, like cats and dogs. And what we see that even for strong supporters, the vote no AI can persuade them, about 7 or 8 points from on the 0 to 100 scale. For non-extreme people, these are people who weren't strongly supportive or strongly against legalizing psychedelics in Massachusetts. For them, we don't have any controls. We randomize them into vote yes and vote no. And again, we see the vote yes AI increases people's belief by about 10 points in the measure, and against, the same thing, about 10 points against. And then we see a mirror pattern more or less for strong opponents, although the effect is quite larger. So basically, the main takeaway from this part here is that for these more local, less polarized settings that people have less prior beliefs about in many cases, we see the same thing but with much larger effects. The effects on the political candidates were more like 2 or 3 points on a 0 to 100 scale. These are more like 5, 10, 15 points. So that's what we see here. So to summarize this one here, so human AI dialogues meaningfully change preference and vote choice. And in the US, these effects are larger than what we find for political ads and things like that. For the Massachusetts ballot and for Canada and Poland, we have larger effects, and we replicate it. I didn't speak about this so much, but we did see 30% of the effect persisted after 4 weeks, so we recontacted people 4 weeks later. And the main sort of takeaway is that AI persuades in these cases using facts and evidence. When we randomize people to have the non-facts and evidence AI, the persuasion is much less. And I didn't talk about the personalization for time. And these are my collaborators on this one. Again, this is very heavily led by House Lin, good guy, very smart. So to conclude the talk overall, because I sort of had 2 separate projects that were similar but different, we showed that personalized human AI dialogues can produce meaningful, long-lasting value change across 2 different domains, politics and charity. We show that evidence-based, factual, tailored arguments reliably can sort of change deeply held preferences. In the first study, we found that human AI dialogues increased effective donations by 45%, and that persuasion seemed to operate through accurate facts, reasons, and alignment with individual values. In the political persuasion project, we found that human AI dialogues made participants about 2% more likely to vote for the aligned candidate of the model, that a good chunk of that effect, 30%, persisted after 4 weeks. We replicated this internationally in Canada and Poland. And in those replications, we causally, using randomization, manipulated the degree to which facts were used and showed that there's a causal relationship between the using of facts and the persuasion. And across both domains, AI persuasion works because it's factual, evidence-driven, and personalized. And the effects are larger, more durable, and broader than what would we traditionally have thought in these domains. And takeaway, reason-giving, evidence-based AI dialogue is a powerful general tool for influencing values accurately and at scale. So again, thank you to all my collaborators in these 2 different projects. And thank you very much for listening. And yeah, I'll happy for questions and thoughts and whatever.
Muchas gracias, Josh. ¿Preguntas?
What do you think about the ethical boundaries of these strategies? Because it's possible to use for the good and for the bad. I think, for example, in this case, maybe it's a bad example, but I think in this controversial case of Cambridge Analytica, that design a specific message for a specific audience or people to change the intention of vote. So where do you draw the line between a helpful message and a manipulation message? Thank you.
Yeah. It's a good question. And to be honest, I think with a lot of this sort of research, we often get people's questions about sort of the ethical component of it. I think one thing I would say is that this is probably already happening out there in the real world. There's lots of bots on Reddit and Twitter and things that are probably doing this sort of stuff. And one of the main motivations for this was sort of an AI safety sort of angle. Was we want to know how damaging this could be. How much could people's opinions move, for example? So the ethical components are very important. In terms of your particular question about like where the line is between maybe a manipulative versus a persuasive message, maybe, I would say a big part of that is probably how much of it is based on the truth. So I think things that are factually inaccurate feels like it's very unethical, and also things that are surreptitious or sort of secret. So where you're pretending to do something you're not. I think in those cases, there might be ethical problems. In all these experiments, we prompted the AI to be persuasive, but also be respectful and correct. So we weren't trying to say, use whatever technique you want, however unethical. We tried to make it more or less ethical techniques in this study. So, but people from our group do have a study where they try to make people believe in conspiracy theories using AI, and that gets a bit shady, I think. But anyway, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying that I think that this is a really great idea, because something that I do personally a lot is I chat with ChatGPT about controversial topics, and it is really helpful for me to learn. And similar to what he said, I think that a lot of people, like the general public, reject behavioral interventions. Like I remember this paper about this group of people that prefer informational interventions rather than interventions that have nudges in them, because they feel like they're being manipulated. So my question here is, how could we frame this specific kind of intervention? Like, how can we talk about this to the general public so that they don't feel like they're being manipulated?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, I think in general, one thing is being open about what's happening. So I think if you're honest, then it's much less of a problem. So what was your first point again? I had something I was going to say about that, and then I lost my train of thought.
About the behavioral interventions?
Yes. So in some cases, I think these sort of interventions are interesting interventions because they probably only really work when we have people who are very attentive and care about, in most of these cases, we're paying people to do the experiment. And so I think there is a very hard question about how you would actually use these interventions in the real world, because you have to get people's attention. And that can be a hard thing. And people who aren't open to evaluating facts and evidence might not be willing to do something like this, right? They might have a conversation with an AI and go, stuff this, I don't believe any of this. So I think that's a very important question. And like, I don't know if you're familiar with the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion, which basically says there's sort of two pathways to persuasion. And one is persuasion through reasons, evidence, and facts. But the point is that they have to be willing to elaborate on those facts and to spend the time thinking about those facts. And so I think all this research, even in Nick's as well, is sort of assuming we can get people who are there, who are willing to elaborate and willing to think through the questions. And I think that's a hard thing about putting this out there at scale. Yeah. And in terms of the ethicality, I think it's a difficult issue. But yeah.
It is. Thank you.
Well, it's not a question, it's like a commentary. I think that the results are interesting because I think that a lot of advertisements from charities appeal more to the emotion and to guilty factors. So it's good and interesting to know that those are not the best strategies.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely, a lot of literature and even our natural experience probably shows that in many cases that is the way charities do try to get more donations, is by emotion and empathy and things like that. I would be cautious to say that I think in some cases, maybe in cases like we're talking about here, where you're not necessarily willing to do the elaboration and the rational argumentation, possibly those emotional strategies might work better. So I would be cautious to say that, in every single case, reasons and evidence are the thing that are going to work. I think in some cases they're going to work and they're going to work really well. But I think the main thing that these papers add is that previously a lot of people thought reasons and evidence don't do anything for charity. Like it's only emotion. And what we're showing is at least, emotion can work in some circumstances, but so can facts, evidence, reason, argumentation back and forth. But yeah, I agree with your point broadly. Yes.
I think you already gave part of the answer, but I still want to make the question.
Yeah, sure.
It is like common knowledge, at least in Mexican politics, that facts and evidence doesn't count, right? People discount facts and evidence, and it's political voting, political choice is very emotionally laden. And your results are very interesting because they point to that. So why is it that AI presentation of facts and evidence seem to make a difference, and the usual political campaigns and advertisements do not work?
Yeah, so I think firstly I would say that I think the view that you said about everyone sort of just knows that it's not really facts and evidence and it's beliefs and, prior tribes that you're part of that matter more in terms of voting. I think that is the general point of view. And I think our study, that still is the case in many cases. So yes, we show effects, but in many cases they were small, right? So we showed that reasons and facts could change people a little bit, but we couldn't completely, go turn somebody from a really pro-Harris person to a pro-Trump person. We could sort of just nudge them a little bit through facts and evidence.
Let me give an example of
Yes.
how important this could have been.
Yes.
About, let me make my mis restas. More than 15 years ago, there was a presidential election where the vote difference was less than 1%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this would have made
That's true.
a huge
that's true.
difference.
It's a good point. Yeah, and so I guess I just want to. So I think this is important. Otherwise, I wouldn't be presenting it. But I'm just trying to say that I think all those things still do definitely matter. I'm not saying that it's just reasons and facts and that emotion and these things don't count at all. In terms of your second question you had, which was sort of like. I can never remember two questions in my head. I remember it, and then I forgot it straight away. Which was like how it's working. Like why is AI doing it better than maybe humans? And I think one of the aspects is just like this, the fact that they have access to all the information in the world, basically, and that they can, no matter what the person says, they can just respond with facts and evidence. They're going to have all that facts and evidence. They're not going to get annoyed or any of those sorts of human foibles maybe there. The other thing is we haven't actually done this study and shown it with humans. So there's some chance that maybe with humans, if you did something similar, it would work a little bit. We don't know exactly. But in most of these persuasive domains, the AIs are better or similar to humans. So.
And do you consider any issues of self-selection? People who are willing to participate and in some way be convinced?
Yeah, so I think self-selection could be a problem of generalizability. So in this case, we use randomization to put people in the different conditions. So self-selection obviously can't have any sort of can't be biasing the treatment effect estimates at all. but it can be we might be biasing towards a particular sample of people on online samples who are more likely to change their minds. And I think that's very possible. And with all this work, what we're trying to do, and particularly with the charity stuff, I've talked with a few different charities about trying to do field experiments where we can try to do this in the real world, similar things, maybe a bit less ambitious, but similar things in the real world to try to get around questions like selection effects and generalizability. So I think it's an important question and one we would like to address in future work.
Thank you. ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Well, regarding the ethics of AI, I think it is I find a little concerning that the use of ChatGPT for this kind of research, because I think you get lots of good insights and you can do your research with those resources, but at the same time, it is like a trade-off because ChatGPT is being trained with that data, so I think it is something that should really be considered, given the fact that it can be used for non-good reasons or for bad reasons. So I think my question would be, have your team considered developing your own LLM systems for that reason? So you can do like an AI that is more stretched, or like a proxy or something that is working outside of ChatGPT or other AI systems.
Yeah, so in this study, we used all the publicly available models. In other studies that people have done, so I mentioned that the political persuasion papers coming out in Nature. There's another paper coming out in Science on the same day with some of those same authors, where they basically did persuasion, not just in politics, but in politics in like 20 different domains. They used the LLM, they used the closed source models, they used their own models, they did fine tuning. So maybe they did some of those things you're talking about. And in most of those cases, yeah, maybe the type of model you use, whether you fine tune or not, those things can have some effect on the results. But in general, it works for all the different models, maybe more or less for different cases, but it's always working pretty much. Yeah, and so definitely the ethical concerns with all this is important. So I was been working with a charity on trying to use the charity stuff with them, and basically they're worried that people might, in talking to the bot, give away personal health information, which then has lots of like privacy laws, and then if the data then goes to some third-party company like ChatGPT. So people are working on these sorts of things, and even ChatGPT is giving some universities their own versions of GPT that they have full control over. But anyway, the point I'm making is that this stuff's all very important and things we all think about. But yeah.
Thank you.
Si no hay más preguntas, démosle un aplauso. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Y con esto damos cierre a nuestro coloquio. Muchísimas gracias al Seminario de Investigación en Ciencias del Comportamiento y por parte del proyecto ICSE, Facultad de Economía y Facultad de Psicología respectivamente. Les agradecemos mucho a los ponentes, ¿no?, y a todos los asistentes aquí en la sala y en nuestras redes. Muchísimas gracias.